Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It started with a photograph. A small curling black and white image found in the back of an estate sale Bible, slipped between the brittle pages of the Book of Ruth. Two men stand side by side, their faces eerily similar. Too similar. Their jaws are narrow, their foreheads high, their eyes set just a touch too close together. One has his hand on the other's shoulder, the gesture too intimate for strangers, but too rehearsed for brothers. And between them, wrapped in a thin cotton blanket, is a baby. On the back, in trembling handwriting, "Our boy, fathers, both." It would be easy to dismiss it as a joke, a relic from a time when people scrawled nonsense on photographs to get a laugh. But the more you look, the harder it is to shake the truth clawing at the edges of the image. Their faces aren't just similar, they're near copies, born of a family where the same blood has cycled, generation after generation, until the family tree no longer branched, only coiled. The photo led me to a town that's barely a town at all, not on any current map, and if you ask too many questions you'll be met with blank stares or sudden silences. In the county courthouse, the birth records list the child's father as unknown, but old-timers talk in half-sentences about the brothers who weren't brothers, about a family name that once held sway over every acre, every barn, every soul in the valley, until their own blood betrayed them. The men in the photograph were said to be both the child's fathers, not metaphorically, but in the raw biological sense. The kind of claim that sounds impossible until you begin digging into the truth about how deep their families' inbreedings are. Went. In their bloodline, fathers could be brothers, cousins could be uncles, and a single man could be both parent and grandparent to the same child. What happened in that town didn't just break laws, it broke nature's design. And the baby in the photograph was the living proof, a child born not of love, but of a genetic spiral so tight it collapsed in on itself. The trail of the photograph led me to a house the locals call the Holler Place, though it's hardly a house anymore. Its roof has caved in at one end, ivy gripping the walls like a patient predator, windows sagging inward with the weight of years. But step inside, and the air changes. Dust hangs thick, and the smell of rot and mildew gives way to something sharper, like old iron. Blood, maybe, if memory could have a scent. On the second floor, in a bedroom with peeling floral wallpaper, I found the first real piece of the puzzle, a box of letters tied with twine. They were dated between 1947 and 1953, each one signed only with the initial J. The handwriting trembled like the photograph's inscription, as though written in haste or fear. The letters spoke of the agreement between two men who shared more than just a roof. They were both descendants of a long, isolated lineage, the kind where neighbors were more likely to be kin than strangers. According to the letters, their mother, yes, the same woman, had instructed them to keep the blood strong. She believed, with a conviction both unshakable and deranged, that introducing outsider blood would destroy what she called the gift. But the gift was a curse. By the late 1940s, the family had become a closed loop, generation after generation folding back on itself. Birth defects, mental instability, and an eerie sameness in the faces of every new child were no longer anomalies. They were expectations. The men in the photograph weren't just relatives, they were half-brothers. And also, through another tangle of lineage, cousins to themselves. One letter hinted at the unthinkable, that the baby's conception had been ensured by both men within the same cycle, that it wasn't just a matter of uncertainty over who the father was, but a deliberate act to make the child twice ours. This wasn't lust, it wasn't even love. It was legacy, twisted, obsessive legacy. And when the baby was born, the midwife refused to record the father's name. She knew, as did everyone in that room, that to write it down would be to admit the truth, a truth no one outside those walls would believe or forgive. I left the Holler Place that night feeling like I'd stepped into a story the earth itself was trying to bury. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized This wasn't the first time that family had done something like this. The family name had once been spoken with a kind of reverence in the valley, though not for kindness or generosity. They owned the land, nearly all of it, and with land came power. In the early 1900s, when the railroad bypassed the town, they didn't leave like so many others. They stayed, and they made sure no one else came in. Over the decades, the family developed its own rules, unwritten but ironclad: no marrying outside the bloodline, no strangers welcomed past the fence. Outsiders were not to be trusted, not to be spoken to beyond a nod at the market. Even trade with other towns dwindled. Everything they needed was grown, built, or birthed among themselves. By the 1930s, their isolation had gone from a choice to a prison. The children were born pale and frail, their eyes clouded before their first birthdays. Stories spread of babies with fused fingers, of voices that never learned to form words, of minds that wandered long before old age. But within the family, these things were spoken of like acts of God, inevitable and not to be questioned. When the brothers, if we can even call them that, were born, they were already bound by more than sibling blood. Their father was also their uncle, their mother both parent and aunt. The records are so tangled that even the county's oldest archivist admitted to me that it's like looking at a snake trying to eat its own tail. Still, they were chosen, groomed from childhood to inherit not just the land, but the family's mission of keeping the blood pure. The midwife who delivered them told a friend, years later, that the boys looked like twins born years apart. Same wide-set jaw, same sloping shoulders, same glassy blue eyes that never seemed to focus quite right. And yet, they were prized. The men were told they carried something sacred in their veins, something the world outside would never understand. They believed it. By the time they reached manhood, it wasn't a question of if they would father the next generation together, it was only a question of when. The baby in the photograph was the culmination of decades of planning, secrecy, and denial. But what the family called destiny, the rest of the world would have called horror. And behind the curtain of their isolation, a much darker truth was beginning to surface, one that would destroy even their own belief in the gift. I found the darker truth in the county archives, buried in a stack of coroner's reports so old they'd turned the color of tobacco. One name kept reappearing, not just in deaths, but in births, in marriages, in property disputes. The family's matriarch, the same woman who had told her sons to keep the blood strong. Her influence was everywhere. She was the one who arranged which cousin would marry which sibling, who decreed that certain children were too weak to live among the rest and were sent away, though no one could tell me where away was. In her eyes, there was no greater sin than letting foreign blood into the line, and she enforced that belief with a kind of quiet violence. One report in particular caught my attention, 1949. Infant male. Cause of death: complications from congenital defects. But the notes in the margin were what chilled me. Features inconsistent with known parentage, possible outsider. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged, as though someone didn't want the words to stay legible for long. That baby wasn't buried in the family plot. No marker, no record beyond that slip of paper. It became clear that the brothers' union, producing the child in the photograph, wasn't just a result of their own warped upbringing. It was orchestrated, controlled, almost ritualized. The matriarch's belief was that combining the same blood twice over would burn away the weakness she'd started to see in recent generations. But she was wrong. The baby survived, yes, but his survival came at a cost. Witnesses, now in their 80s, remembered a child who never spoke, who walked only with assistance, whose head seemed too large for his tiny shoulders. They whispered that he stared at people in a way that made their skin crawl, as if he could see something in them no one else could. And then, one day, he was gone. No illness, no accident, just gone. His existence erased so completely that only a single photograph and a scattering of half-buried stories remain. Some say he was sent away like the others. Others say the family decided he wasn't the one after all. What happened next in that town would unravel everything the family had built, and it started with someone from the outside breaking through the fence. It was the summer of 1956 when the outsider came. He wasn't a preacher or a salesman or a drifter, at least not in the way the town understood those words. He was a surveyor hired by the county to assess the land for a proposed highway expansion. His name appears only once in official records, but in the oral histories passed quietly between the few who remember, he's described as a man who asked too many questions and stayed too long to be polite. The valley wasn't used to strangers. For decades, the family had made sure the road signs pointed elsewhere, the bridges crumbled, the paths overgrown. But this man had maps, tools, and the authority of the state. He went where others weren't allowed, and one of those places was straight through the family's land. The brothers, both fathers of the child, were in their 30s by then. Hardened men, their bodies weathered by farm work, their minds shaped by a lifetime of the same stories told over and over about purity, pride, and outsiders bringing ruin. But something about the surveyor unsettled them. Maybe it was the way he spoke directly to the women. Maybe it was the way he didn't look away when their mother, now gaunt but still sharp as a knife, watched him from the porch. The official version is that the man packed up after a week and never returned. The unofficial one, the one whispered in gas stations miles away, is that he saw something he shouldn't have, something involving the child. Some say the surveyor stumbled upon the boy in the woods, walking hand in hand with both of his fathers, that he noticed the way they hovered over him, speaking in a language that wasn't quite English, wasn't quite anything. Others say he saw the boy's face up close and understood, in that instant, the tangled truth of his bloodline. What we do know is this. A month after the surveyor arrived, the brothers began building a fence. Not the short, weathered kind that marked property lines, but a wall of stacked timber, 8 feet high with no gate. It didn't just keep people out, it kept someone in. The child was seen less and less after that. The few who caught glimpses said his head had grown even larger, his eyes darker, his movements stranger. And then, in the winter of 1957, even the fence stood empty. No boy, no sound. The truth of what happened might have been buried forever, if not for a discovery made years later in the shallow ground behind the Holler Place. The discovery came in the summer of 1974 when a group of teenagers dared each other to break into the Holler Place. By then, the house had been abandoned for more than a decade. The roof had rotted through, the doors hung loose on rusted hinges, and the floors bowed dangerously with every step. They weren't looking for history. They were looking for a thrill. Some broken bottles, maybe a few leftover relics from the family's strange past. What they found instead was a patch of earth in the backyard, different from the rest. It was sunken slightly, as though the ground had caved in on itself. One of them kicked at it, expecting to hit stone, but instead felt the dull thud of wood. An old box. The teenagers pried it open with a tire iron. Inside, wrapped in a piece of rotted quilt, was the skeleton of a child. The sheriff's report noted the unusual size of the skull, disproportionate to the body, and the strange wear on the bones, as though the child had never walked unaided. The estimated age was around 8, though one of the examining doctors remarked that the growth plates told a more complicated story. The box contained more than bones. There was a second, smaller bundle. Inside it, 2 gold wedding bands, each engraved with the same initials. J.D., the initials matched both brothers. No official charges were ever filed. The sheriff at the time dismissed the find as an old family tragedy, saying there was no way to prove the remains belonged to the boy from the photograph. But privately, several townspeople told me they had no doubt. The boy's disappearance, the sudden silence from the family, the construction of the fence, it all led here. What happened in the days before that burial remains locked away in the memories of those few who lived through it. Some claim the child had grown increasingly violent, lashing out at animals and even at his own kin. Others whisper about a sickness, something that spread quickly among the family after his birth, something that left them weaker, more unstable than before. By the late 70s, the last of the bloodline had either died or vanished. The land was parceled off, the house left to rot. Only the photograph and the bones remained to tell the story, a story the county quietly hoped everyone would forget. But stories like this don't fade. They sit, patient, waiting for someone to dig them up again. And once they surface, they never let go. Even now, decades later, the photograph has a weight to it, as if it carries the residue of everything that happened in that valley. I've shown it to genealogists, historians, even a forensic anthropologist. They all say the same thing. The odds of a child having two biological fathers in the way this family claimed are vanishingly small, possible only under rare, almost impossible circumstances. And yet, when you trace the lines of that family tree, when you see how tightly the branches twist back on themselves, impossible starts to lose its meaning. Somewhere in the blood of those men, their roles as brothers, cousins, and uncles blurred until fatherhood itself became a shared claim. Science may argue the details, but the lived truth in that town was simpler. That child was theirs, both of theirs, in every sense they understood. The baby with two fathers never had a chance. He was born into a prison made not of walls, but of blood. His life was mapped out before he took his first breath, crafted to fulfill an idea that had poisoned generations, and when he didn't fit the shape they'd carved for him, he was erased. The land where the Holler Place once stood is overgrown now, the remains of the house long since collapsed into the soil. If you walk there in late autumn, when the air smells of leaf rot and the wind carries the cries of far-off crows, you can almost hear the echo of a child's laughter, or maybe it's something else entirely. Some say the photograph surfaces now and then at flea markets, in estate boxes, even tucked into the drawers of antique shop desks. It always vanishes again. Some swear it's cursed, that those who keep it too long start to dream of the boy's face, staring, unblinking, from the dark. The county has no interest in revisiting the case. The grave behind the house is unmarked, the bones long since claimed by the state for research. Boo, and if you ask the old folks in the surrounding hills, they'll tell you the truth isn't gone, it's just hiding, the way it always has. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, that somewhere out there, in another forgotten corner of America, another family is following the same rules, waiting for the next chosen child to be born. Because once you've seen the photograph, once you've traced the bloodline, you realize this wasn't just one family's secret, it's a pattern, and patterns have a way of repeating.